Right, folks, we're about to start our first webinar in a series of webinars that pretty much are trying to help everyone understand exactly what they're going to need to do to become compliant within their cyber compliance, whether you're in the DoD and DibNet, which are going to be CMMC, or within other industries. A lot of the basics are going to be covered here. Each of those have nuances that we'll possibly cover. Our focus today is going to be on CMMC because a lot of our customers and friends and family are in the DoD. Our goal here is to really simplify this. We've been through 2 assessments so far, and I think we have a lot of experience between us and the panel members to be able to give you guys what you need to really understand what you have to do from compliance. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Dwayne Sugars. I'm the president and CEO of Digital Lantern and Digital Lantern Federal. I'm going to introduce our panel members shortly, but again, just want to give you a little introduction and context. We're a fairly new company. We're a small business. We started about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years, I guess, coming up in the summer. And one of the first things we heard is, from our prime contractors, are you in SPURS, or do you have, are you entered into SPURS? Everyone's starting to push out cyber compliance questionnaires and all of this. Even our insurance company was giving it to us. And so we realized pretty early on that we should really look at this not as a mandate, or as sort of a shall or a must. We really wanted to look at this as, okay, what do we need to do to make sure our intellectual property as well as our government information is secure? We spend all the money in companies to create physical security. We have security systems, badging systems. We put all this money into that so that people can't come in, get into your drawers, get into your safes, get into your office. Yet we're not spending any money on making sure the hundreds of thousands of people that have access to the internet don't have access to your crown jewels. And so we really want to look at this as more like, what do we need to do to make sure your business is safe, regardless of whether you're small or mid-size. We really focus on small and mid-size just because I think they have the biggest challenges of really the budget and understanding what it's going to take. So with that, today's session will basically cover these areas. And with that, I'm going to allow the introduction of our panel. Marcella Dennison. She runs our, she's the president of our commercial division called Digital Lantern, but under there, Cyber Lantern, which is a solution set that we have that she runs. So go ahead, Marcella, give a little background on, why you're on the panel, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, everyone. Marcella Dennison here. As Dwayne mentioned, I run the commercial side of the business for Digital Lantern called Cyber Lantern, where we hyper-focus on providing big data security across the board to customers. Part of that includes our automated risk assessment platform, as well as our security operations center 24/7 services, where we offer detection and monitoring. As we mentioned, a lot of our customers actually work within either the DibNet or are required to be compliant with some level of certification or compliance process. And so we've had some experience in talking to customers that are now trying to become CMMC compliant. And that's where my level of expertise comes from this, is just having that background and helping to guide our customers through the process of becoming compliant and understanding some of the intricacies of the compliance process.
Marcella, your background, how long you've been in the cyber space, so to speak, just sort of a little bit about your background and
sure, absolutely. So I actually started in cyber in the U.S. Navy. I've been working in cyber for about 18 years and did my rounds in all of the different areas for the government. So worked on the defensive side, worked on the offensive side, and worked on the intelligence side. And then spent quite a bit of time actually in the National Threat Operations Center at the NSA, where you actually combine all of those different aspects of intel, defense, and offense. So a lot of experience in the Department of Defense world, working with the government, a lot of experience with sensitive information. So that definitely helps in this arena in knowing how to read all of those lovely government documents that help you to become compliant or help to explain how to become compliant.
Excellent. Thank you. Alicia, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Farrell. Some of you I noticed in the attendance list probably know who I am. I worked for 14 and a half years on Capitol Hill as a professional staff member for the Senate Appropriations Committee. So obviously not a cyber background at all, but I did work a lot with the Defense Industrial Base. When I left the Hill in 2015, I got a master's in cyber diplomacy and focused on the technical track. So I am actually tied to Cyber and Digital Lantern because I am their cyber fellow. And I've had the pleasure for the past year now researching anything and everything to include technical, but also policy and compliance issues that the industrial base is focused on. I am here because I feel like I live and breathe CMMC, and every little nuance that comes up, I'm quick to see what it means and what it'll mean for our clientele. I also work as a government relations consultant for several companies in the DC area, and there are a lot of suppliers and vendors to some of these larger companies that are going to need help here. So I would like to help them as best as possible. So that's me.
I learned something about Alicia last week, that she's a good hockey player. Excellent. All right, Ali, can you introduce yourself, sir?
Sure. So my name is Ali Alaj, and my background has been 20 plus years in everything technology. So IT infrastructure, software, data analytics, and cyber. And so one of the reasons why I'm here is because with my recent certification with the CMMC AB as an RP. I've been helping a lot of organizations really focus on CMMC level 3 and above. And then of course it comes down to NIST 800-171 and talking about SPRS scores. I live and breathe it. It's exciting to me. You can call me, I guess, a cyber compliance nerd. It's just my thing. So I'm very excited about this conversation today and hope it helps others really achieve the milestones that they need to in order to participate fully in government contracting.
Awesome. Well, you're going to be answering the first question, so you might as well just
Sure.
stay unmuted.
All right.
Can you just give us sort of the landscape of what cyber compliance meant over the last couple of years? I know people get sort of tired of seeing all these different standards coming out, and sort of just give a basic background of sort of the different ones over the last couple of years and why now more than ever,
Sure.
Are these compliance being pushed out to small businesses, medium-sized business, and large?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, really, it all comes down to the source of DFARS, right? It's NIST 800-171 was part of a lot of, as government contractors, part of the checkbox that we check to say, hey, based on the self-assessment, we meet these 110 controls. And so as the years have gone by, we've had a lot of attacks that have been very public. We can name drop so many of them: SolarWinds, water treatment centers, most recently in Florida. And the reality of it is that with the government, they realize that with a lot of their sensitive project work, that they're going to have a number of contractors that are going to be working at different pieces of the supply chain. And so beyond the self-assessment, they're looking at more ways in order to enforce whether or not these measures are being taken place by organizations. From their perspective, and this is more of the official viewpoint, is that everyone agreed to meeting some certain level of controls. And now it's sort of, okay, we need to now figure out how do we ensure the fact that these organizations are meeting these controls. And so I think within the last couple of years, CMMC was the initiative. That's the starting point. From my viewpoint, it's the starting point, which means, we're going to see other peripheral items that are going to come into play. It's sort of changing on its own. But, to answer the question, it really comes down to, this is the next stage of accountability when it comes to self-assessment. Are you in true form or fashion meeting these compliance requirements that you agree to? And that's why we're in where we're in currently.
All right, excellent. Alicia, can you sort of, when we say CMMC, is it made up of any other?
Oh, Dwayne, we can't hear you.
Yeah, you're.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, much better.
All right, my bad. So Alicia, can you sort of just describe it a little bit about, if we're just looking at CMMC, is it basically comprised of any previous standards, and like what's the difference between this and NIST or any of the others?
Sure. Yeah. So as Ollie mentioned, it goes back to the DFAR. Specifically, CMMC is, well, we'll start with the DFAR. DFAR 7012 is the DFAR specifically tied to NIST 800-171. CMMC took that and added 20 additional controls to the DFAR 7012, and they became DFAR 70, I believe 21 through 24. So what that did was, not only are companies required to adhere to DFAR 7012 if they want to be level 3 in the CMMC hierarchy, they now have to do the 7012, all those controls that are associated with 7012, and then also 20 additional controls as laid out or identified through the new DFAR 7021 through 7024. Just to touch on a point there, a lot of people were wondering, why did we not try and enforce more compliance and accountability to the initial DFAR 7012 instead of creating this whole new architecture? I would say part of that was related to what Congress passed back in 2020 in the NDAA, mandating this review and this new compliance infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you. Marcella, can you sort of take some of the numbers that Alicia is talking about, and sort of from the standpoint of practicality, what does that actually mean for a company? What are the major hurdles when you're looking at trying to pursue a compliance score?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, just understanding, what does that score actually mean, and how do I get to it? And I think a lot of times when we talk to companies that are, trying to go through the CMMC process, the first question that they have is, what is CUI, and do I even have it? And so it's just that initial point of entry. And we're not just talking about small companies that don't have this understanding, right? We talk to large organizations that have been working with the government for a long time, that are still trying to decipher exactly what that means and what is the process that they have to go through to become compliant. So it's not really, it's not very clear necessarily, unless you start to talk to someone who is an expert, what those steps are going to be. And if you have any kind of experience whatsoever with your organization in having to go through some level of certification, such as a NIST certification, then it becomes a little bit easier to start to understand what does that process actually look like. But at the end of the day, what it really is, it's getting your security house in order, right? So what we really try to hyper focus on with getting through that initial hurdle and obstacle, because that is really the biggest one, I think, is really getting started. And how do you get started? What does any of it even mean? Is really just having a basic understanding of what it means to have any kind of compliance or to go through any kind of risk assessment and framework. And it's really about understanding your environment, knowing what you have in your environment from the perspective of sensitive systems, sensitive data. How are you protecting that environment, if you're protecting it at all? And what are you doing from a long-term perspective as far as being prepared if you were to have an incident? So that's really the life cycle of how you end up starting the compliance process or the certification process. Of course, the devil is always in the details, but a lot of times people get hung up on that first component of, what is CUI, and do I really need to do this? And I think that the biggest thing that we can, that we can communicate to organizations when we're going through that is that, you shouldn't hyper focus necessarily on whether you have this data or not, but really hyper focus on the fact that you need to have some level of security in place regardless today. You know, whether you're going through CMMC compliance or not, you should be focused on actually getting your house in order from a security perspective. And so it's really just about trying to look at it from a holistic point of view and saying, okay, instead of just hyper focusing on the fact that I'm trying to become CMMC compliant, let me do an overhaul of my entire environment and really try to become secure overall. Because it helps in the process when you start to do that to actually just go through the check boxes of getting compliant.
Oh, excellent. Well, leads us to the next point and the next slide. We'll get into more of, you know, first of all, the definition of CUI, but I guess, you know, from a small business, actually from any business, when someone starts telling you you're mandated to do something, you're less likely to want to do it. I mean, that's just human nature. And so when we start looking at the mandates, the shalls and the must and all those kinds of things, what is the driving force behind this? You kind of touched on it, Marcella, but at the same time, maybe Ali, you can sort of describe exactly what the shalls and must really mean. What does a compliance actually mean? And do you need to be fully compliant? Do you need to be partially compliant? What does any of that stuff actually mean?
You know, I think it just really depends on if we're talking CMMC and we're talking level 3, which is the starting point to be able to handle CUI data. It's a all or nothing scenario. And being a maturity model, you do start at level 1. You do meet certain levels of control. So let's say, as an example, that maybe the contract that you're on doesn't really require CUI. You still have level 1 and 2. And as you go through the process of meeting the objectives of level 1 and then level 2, if you're not quite at level 3, it really, you know, it comes down to it for any small business is really the business development aspects, right? So if you know that you have a potential opportunity in the pipeline that maybe in your current scenario doesn't really require level 3, you know, during that sort of window, you know, achieving level 1 and then working your way to level 2 will help you, you as an organization sort of take the time to mature into level 3, right? So that it's not a scenario where you're trying to adopt everything that level 3 has, because it is a lot of work. And so a lot of times, you know, with the question of whether or not, you know, do we need to be fully in compliance? Can we be partially? You know, my question back is, do you have any opportunity that requires you to be at a level 3 and that you know that you're going to handle CUI? And if you know that and it's within a year or less, then the answer is you have to be completely in compliance, right, by the time that award occurs. If it's beyond a year, then I would say for right now, you don't need to work. Let's work on level 1 and 2 and then gradually get you to the point where if you have that within 1 year window, then start thinking about getting to that level 3 from 2.
Thank you. Alicia, can you sort of describe a little bit about the necessity for this more than the mandate? I mean, everyone, and I know when I say everyone, that includes us, you never expect to be owned. You never expect to have ransomware happen to you. So when you really start looking at this, and we've all sort of touched on it so far, is just, and we start approaching this, what really should be our driving force? Again, obviously knowing that you have to be at some level for government contracting is vitally important for your business sustainability. But what other kinds of things should people be looking at from the standpoint of just, as Marcella said, keeping your house in order?
Yeah, so, and I think Marcella actually mentioned it earlier too in the previous question. It just makes sense to be secure. We lock up all our physical assets. We lock up our cars when we, you know, park them at night. We lock up our house. But what are we doing to protect ourselves on the internet? And we go on the internet every day, except if you're in a SCIF or a classified environment, you're pretty much going on the internet on your work computer, probably. I would say probably 85% of the time. So it is important to understand that whenever you do that, you do open up some sort of portal or hole or opening for someone to take a look at what your business or maybe your IP or get access to things that you don't want them to get access to. I know Marcel and I are both of the more paranoid version of people who just like, it's an opening, they can get in. And I'm married to a security employee of, he does security for a living, and he said, I don't really have anything hackers want. Well, that's not the point. You don't want people in your house. You don't want them walking in, even if you have no furniture in your house, you don't want them there. So I think the important thing to do for a business is to make sure you have locked down your infrastructure, your network infrastructure, as well as your physical infrastructure. And it isn't just because you're owning a contract now and you're working with another entity who also has their own house that you're now being allowed to come into and visit. You wouldn't go into your neighbor's house and leave the doors open and invite all the other neighbors that they don't know, anything about. So using that analogy, I think that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out, why am I protecting it? Well, because I would say it's polite, but it's also just important to secure, because you don't know who's coming through your front door or your back door, especially your back door in this case.
Excellent. So Marcella, I think we've dealt with this with lots of companies who the first thing they say is sort of like, oh, well, we don't have any CUI, controlled unclassified information. We don't have any of that. Yeah, we do work for the government, but we don't have any of that. So I guess given the supply chain element of CMMC and the fact that it's no longer the prime only needing some kind of compliance, but it's the subs in the whole supply chain, how should people be looking at CUI and other types of data that they really ultimately should be protecting?
Yes, I mean, it really shouldn't, it's like I mentioned earlier, you really shouldn't, just be hyper focused on saying, okay, well, let me go identify if I have this sensitive information. Because chances are, if you look at the list that's in front of you now, at some point, if you're a supply chain provider, if you're a sub, if you're a prime on a DoD contract, chances are you have some level of this information out there. So the first thing that's critical in this situation is not so much trying to pinpoint, exactly which components of the data are CUI, but it's really more, I think, of understanding it from like a wrapper perspective of saying, okay, if this part of my company or my organization is working with the Department of Defense, or if we are a supply chain provider to a prime contractor, or if we're a subcontract to this, or if we're a prime ourselves, what you really should be focused on is identifying the systems and the locations of where that type of data that is utilized for the Department of Defense is being stored, and just treating that entire space and that environment as if it held CUI. And so it's really more about understanding how to properly segment that part of your network so that it remains secure. Because again, it could be something as simple as information that you have in your signature block that you didn't even realize was CUI. So when we have a discussion about, actually safeguarding the CUI itself, instead of trying to compartmentalize each component of the data that is considered sensitive, unclassified information, you should really focus on where does this information live within my network, and how do I properly secure that location within my network so that I am protected in the manner in which the Department of Defense is expecting me to be protected, instead of trying to kind of segment it down to the smaller components of the data itself.
All right, excellent. I think one of the things that we sort of, in some ways, doing this compliance as a large business is way more complicated than it is for small to mid-sized businesses. Us starting a year and a half ago, we knew that this was coming, so we sort of built our infrastructure to sort of be segregated between our federal and commercial side. We also made an effort to commercial cloud infrastructure as much as we could, not have it as much on-prem kind of stuff. And so as we start this next half an hour is going to be really about how do we begin? You know, what do we do to start? How do we start? How do we look at 100 and some controls and make any sense of that? And we'll discuss also, like, where do you get the big bang for the buck if you buy a certain firewall? Do you get a n number of controls? We're not going to get into details of that, but Ali, if you can sort of just talk a little bit about where do you get started in this without looking, you know, when you start looking at all those controls, the first thing you're going to do is look at some of the questions and go, I don't even know what that means. So how do you get started?
Sure. You know, the common suggestion is really on self-assessment. So having an understanding of where you feel you are, and there are a lot of different self-assessments that someone could take. It really just depends on the type of organization, but really, you know, at a high level, it's just understanding where you are, and then start looking at how does your current infrastructure operate. You know, I've seen a lot of organizations think about in terms of, do I need to go organization wide? Do I have separate parts of my business that don't necessarily require CUI? You know, easy way is one's commercial and one's, you know, federal government, federal contracting. And so if you have a scenario that's similar, a lot of times it's sort of looking at, and what you said, Dwayne, as far as looking at, you know, off-prem solutions that are going to be in compliance. These are some of the areas of low-hanging fruit. You know, Office 365, you know, Azure, Microsoft is really putting a very strong foot forward into this realm. But, you know, to circle it back and not get too far too fast, what's the starting point? Self-assessment. You know, there's, again, options there. Knowing where you are and how far you need to go is the starting point to really determine, can you handle this internally, or do you need external help to sort of translate, you know, what each of these controls really mean. And I think if you start there, you'll get a sense of, you know, what resources you have internally, what resources you need externally, to sort of start putting the puzzle pieces together to get towards compliance.
Thank you. Marcella, can you talk a little bit about, I guess when it comes down to it, what kinds of things would give you the biggest bang for your buck as a small to mid-sized business? Like what endpoint, firewall? I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, convert the system here. I'm just saying that when you really start doing a self-assessment, you have to translate that to, you know, a technology and practice kind of scenario where, like, okay, what does that actually mean? Do I have to buy something, or is that a policy? So can you sort of just discuss some of the things that some of the organizations you're dealing with are using to at least get some of the major compliance elements addressed without really ever not necessarily not reading it, but not knowing exactly what all of them mean?
Yeah, so there's a few ways to look at this, right? Like I mentioned, there's a cyclical process that really goes into any kind of risk assessment or compliance framework. And that first step is the identify step. So typically the way it works is you have your identify, you have your protect, you have your detect and response. And each one of these components has several different layers of you know, practice, process, and technology that needs to be embedded into it. So it can definitely get confusing very quickly if you're a small organization and you have just no idea where to start. But some of the main components that you should really hyper focus on to try to get on the right path to compliance. First of all, if there's a good risk assessment tool that you can use that's automated and easy to use, then I would definitely start there, just from an ease of trying to get a temperature check of where you're at, right? Where am I at in this process in general? By being able to answer some very basic questions through some level of automated risk assessment tool. But from a protect perspective, some of the focuses for small organizations should really be putting up some segmentations or barriers within your network, right? So if we look at it from a very basic layered approach, and I know, you know, people are kind of trying to go away from the layered approach, but when you are a small organization and you have nothing, I think that's actually a really good basic place to start. And some of the things that you're going to need to do is protect the assets and the systems in which all of this information lives. So from a cloud perspective, obviously, if you're using Office 365 or AWS or Azure, a lot of those different cloud infrastructures already have some level of security alerting and monitoring within them that you can subscribe to. I believe some of them are even free at this point in time. From an endpoint perspective, where you actually want to be able to protect the devices in which your organization and your company works on, right? Especially now that everybody is working primarily remotely. Having some sort of endpoint detection tool on your devices so that your employees can utilize their laptops and know that if there's something malicious or anomalous that comes through, the laptop will automatically quarantine it, put it off to the side, or delete whatever it is so that you're not getting those endpoints infected. And then the other is obviously some level of perimeter security, right? Depending on whether you have people who are working in an office or not, having some level of firewall or web application firewall that actually protects your users from anything that may be attacking them, right? And having these different security measures in place helps you in the long run, because now you actually have logs and documentation, right, that show you what's going on within your environment. Now you have visibility into what's happening within your environment, and that's really important for that detection and response phase. So by putting these security measures in place, you're already taking some level of proactive approach to block whatever may be happening within your environment. And the next step after that is now understanding, okay, I understand what's running on my network. I know I have these cloud systems, or these cloud environments. I have these endpoint environments. I have these entry and exit points into my network that I'm monitoring through firewalls. Now you can actually do some level of continuous detection and monitoring on all of those things, so that you have situational awareness of what's happening on your network on a consistent basis. And that's really where you start to be able to understand what happens in your environment, and you can start to understand if something's happening that isn't normal for your environment. So that component of not just putting in protections, but actually monitoring those protection devices so that you have a constant understanding of what's happening is really, really crucial. Because once you do have that understanding, now when something happens, it's really important for you to be able to know how to respond to it, right? And that's where all of those policies and all of that documentation comes into play. It's basically saying, hey, I know what's on my environment. I know what protections I have in place. And so when one of those protections falls short or there's a gap, you now know what type of plan you have to have in place to actually respond to an incident. And that's actually where a lot of organizations fail, is in that response. Because you can have all the protections in place and you can have all the right devices in the right place and your network could be segmented. But if you get, if you have an attack on your network, or you end up having an incident, how you respond to that incident is really what makes or breaks how much time, money, effort, and how much damage is going to happen to your brand in the process.
All right. Alicia, can you just talk briefly about supply chain in the context that, even if you're a DoD contractor and maybe you're not holding CUI information, if you go out and buy firewalls, or you go out and buy technology that's maybe from places in the world that you don't necessarily want to be buying it. And I say that only in the way that we've had wireless routers that we see actually start pinging and doing things out to different countries. But how should people look at supply chain? I mean, not going crazy because this is a global economy, but how should they look at supply chain?
So great point. It is important to understand the technology you're buying and where you're getting it, and and who actually owns it and who developed it. And because if they've developed it and you're buying this device, if you're not playing with the inner workings of it like we do at Digital Lantern, you may not know where your information is going, especially if you're a small company. So it is good to know what you're buying. It is good to pay attention to a lot of the news reports out there. I know we're all tired of the news at this point, but some of the reporting has, for technology and start sort of the rip and replace provisions we've seen from Congress as far as, we're not buying these products anymore. These are on this list. Those are good things to pay attention to, I think. Looking at some of the State Department, if you call it the blacklist, if you will, or the dark list of countries that we don't do business with, you should really make sure your technology doesn't come from any of those. And we're at this precarious situation with China. Not encouraged to buy those devices at this time, especially if you're going to be doing government contracting, government work. Just buying something off the shelf and not really understanding where it came from, who made it, or knowing where the signals are going, where the data is going, is not the best practice. I would not recommend that ever. Even for your own home. When you do buy these devices, and let's say you buy since Marcella mentioned we are all working from home at this point, a lot of us, if you do buy an assistant like an Alexa or whatever, a Siri or whatever assistant you're using these days, should probably look at and do some research a little bit on how to secure that device, like how to cut off certain protocols, protocols as far as where the data would go to or where it would ping, or some of the known protocol doors that we don't want information going through because they're just not secure. And hopefully that's still not too difficult for a lot of people. I think as we move forward, it sounds really hard. It sounds like a lot of research. Once you start looking at it and knowing what to look for, I think it'll get easier. I think people will start to pick up on this idea that, hey, we don't want that because it's maybe that device or that technology is running through a TLS1 connection, which is pretty geeky for me to say that, but everyone don't do that because that's outdated and it's not supported anymore. And that's on the NIST website. They'll tell you don't do that. And that's the other thing. We can use a lot of government agencies too to help identify what would be approved, what would be ideal. NIST does do a lot of education on that front. It is a lot of reading because there are a lot of smart people over at NIST, but I think it's worth taking a look at.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'll just finish this section up by saying that, a lot of, even when talked about using commercial cloud infrastructure, we see constantly for our customers who are using Amazon and Google and Azure is that their data is being pushed to every place in the globe that has a environment that Amazon has or Azure has. And so you really have to understand exactly, if you're just saying I'm going out to a commercial cloud, you also got to realize that some of those might be in Hong Kong, some of those might be, in different places of the world that might not want your data going to, especially if it's government type of information. The other last thing I'll say is firewalls. We basically, we've been through 2 assessments. The first one, I can't even tell you how disappointing it was, but it was. But the reality is what we got out of that is get a firewall and get a pretty good one. Doesn't have to be expensive, $1,400 bucks. And so we go to DISA's website and look for DoD approved things, and there's all kinds of places to get DoD approved technology. And so we buy off of that list and we make sure that we, get those kinds of things. So firewall is a big one for sure. And then after that, I think continuous monitoring, something like a SOC or a MSP would give you a lot of other controls because they're doing a lot of the other stuff for you. So with that in mind, let's get on to just talk a little bit about what CMMC really means relative to levels. And without getting into the details, what does it actually entail? And we'll get into some of the things in the next session or the next section here about cost and all that kind of stuff. But maybe, Ali, if you can sort of just describe that, sort of that slide that's up on the screen and give a sense of what that really means. Time, cost, effort.
Sure. The way I look at it, so these are all the capability domains on the left. So if you look at the left, the blue boxes, those are where your policies would need to capture as far as at a categoric level, right? And so if you look through each one, it talks about how you access the systems, what happens if there's an issue with the system, how do you respond to it, identifying what risks that you have, and so on and so forth. The graphic on the right comes down to how each of these domains fit into the level of certification. As mentioned prior, as level 1, level 2 really handles FCI data, non-COI related data, whereas level 3, 4, and 5 are the areas where you would be handling COI level data. And so level 1 and 2, quite honestly, cost-wise, you're talking, well, let me kind of step it back. Let's talk about the process. Process is assessment, getting prepared. And then as you go through preparation, is enforcing the controls. And then once you get into a place of operational, you then apply or reach out to a C3PAO who then will provide the assessment services. They do the assessment, come back with you to tell you if there's any issues that you can remedy, and then they submit to the AB board for your certification. The AB can also come back with any findings that they may have. For a level 1 or 2, the process should be fairly quick. The preparation portion of it could be about a month, 2 months. As you get to level 3 and up to 5, that preparation could be longer, especially if you don't have any items in place. 3 to 4 months, 5 months. They recommend that you are operational for 6 months at least after preparation. From that point on, then you would submit to the assessment, which no one's being assessed currently, but the guess is anywhere from 2 weeks to about 4 or 5 months, depending on the findings, and then the submission to the AB board, which has its own time frame. And so from start to finish, you're probably talking about a year out. If you're really efficient, you have a simplified environment, it can be less than that. But so far what we're seeing is from start to finish, to get ready for assessment, you're probably talking at least 6 to 7 months out, and then add on the assessment portion and the submission to AB.
Excellent. Alicia, policies. We hate them. We need them. I guess we don't want them, but we have to do them. And when you start talking about policies, what we realized while we started this process is you think an SSP or an SOP covers you, and then all of a sudden you realize all the controls are asking for specific policies. So can you talk about, understanding what, where to find, well, maybe not where to find policies, but where to go to look for templated policies or things of that sort, or how important it is just to get some of these basic policies in place, because that will hit a lot of these controls.
So maybe the best place to start for anybody who's doing it and focused on CMMC would be to go some of these government websites that offer some help with the CMMC piece. And I have identified so many of these where they offer templates, not just for policies really, but also for setting up your SSP and your POAM and various documentation that are supposed to help you identify where you are in your compliance, your level of compliance, and maybe help you get your first SPRS score, and then maybe also help you identify when you go to somebody like Ollie to figure out where to start. Because we all know that everybody's trying to figure out where's my starting point. And some of these, there's I believe is it MISI over in I'm trying to remember the Maryland organization that offers some sort of template help there, to just things to consider as you go through and set up your policies, your written policies, your compliance policies. And for whatever reason, I'm blanking at the moment what those are, but there's a lot of organizations out there that are willing to help you do this without costing an arm and a leg too, if maybe not even costing anything at all. I think NIST is another great resource again for identifying policy templates. I believe the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program I believe that's the one that assists small businesses, especially for cybersecurity purposes. I understand they have some templates, and they also have resources to help these small companies get compliant and without breaking the bank, hopefully, even offering money to help them with their compliance efforts. So that would be where I'd start.
Okay. Marcella, a lot of folks that we deal with think having a SSP or an SOP in place, is good enough. One, is it? And then two, if it isn't, I think I know the answer. Where would you start? Would you start at the individual policies, or would you start at the SOP level, get the framework, and then go down to the policies? I mean, I know there's no given or perfect way, but what would you recommend?
I think that it's really important for you to kind of get the operational perspective down first. So working with those standard operating procedures first, and really understanding what your processes are going to be for all of the above, right? So understanding what are my password policies going to be? How am I going to handle an incident when it happens? Do I have an incident response team on retainer that I'm going to call? Do I have a good way of quarantining specific devices? So with smaller organizations that have less resources at hand, obviously, I think, putting in as much automation as possible, or having a third-party company help you, such as a managed service provider that's going to kind of just take care of all of this for you, is really going to be the best case scenario. But it's really important for you to kind of understand, like, how am I operating, right? Like, where am I starting my operations point? What do I already have in place, so that you can assess those gaps and understand, okay, so this is what I'm already doing. Then you have to be able to look at that level of where you need to be, and figuring out what are the steps that I need to take to get there. And that's where you should start to implement your policies, right? And have the discussions about, okay, let me start putting down on paper exactly what it is that, I expect from a policy perspective. But I think until you have some level of visibility into what's already in place and where you need to be going, it's hard to just say, like, okay, let me just start writing a bunch of policies, right off the bat, without having some level of operational capabilities in place. And a lot of times organizations are being very heavily reliant on their IT teams to put these, policies and procedures together. And I can't stress enough that, while IT people are great, and they have some level of understanding of the network, your IT person is not going to be your security expert, okay? And that's really important for organizations to understand, especially small organizations. It's great that you have an IT person who's willing to step up and, take control of all of this, but that's the equivalent of me saying, I'm gonna have a general surgeon perform heart surgery on you, right? It's just a very different level of expertise and understanding of the space. And so it's really important, as you're working with your IT people, to also understand where their gaps are in this knowledge, so that when you are putting your policies in place and you are putting your procedures in place, you know exactly where the buck is going to stop with them, and where you're going to need some level of professional expertise to come in and help you with the rest of the process. And I think I saw a question about that earlier, like, why shouldn't I just purchase an out-of-the-box solution and have my IT person implement it? I mean, that's a good starting point, and you can absolutely do something like that. But is your IT person going to know how to handle an incident when it happens? Are they going to know how to put together a policy that discusses that? And all of these things are very important, not only from the perspective of being able to respond to an incident or respond to something that's happening in your network, but when that insurance company comes to say, when you go put in that insurance claim for an incident you just had, and that insurance company says to you, well, okay, show me exactly what steps you took beforehand and afterwards, is that IT person going to know exactly what to say and exactly what to provide to the insurance company so that you actually have the coverage, versus, them coming back and saying, well, sorry, but you didn't have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, and so, we're not going to cover this claim for you.
All right. Thank you, Marcel. Yeah, it's, we also understand it being a small, mid-sized business, you don't have big budgets to have, a CISO, a IT manager, and things of that sort. That's why sometimes that outsourcing model works, where you can sort of get that level of expertise outside the organization for as long as it takes for you to get it inside your organization. And so let's talk a little bit about cost. And, you know, obviously for any small business, even, you know, any business really, cost is always a concern. If you're going to be mandated to do something, you're going to do the least amount that you have to do to be, you know, compliant. And we really don't like thinking about that. That way we'd rather look at it, let's get all the right pieces in place and then see where we are compliant and then just fill some of the holes. And so, Alicia, maybe talk a little bit about some of the big, you know, some of the cost things as you're going through compliance, firewalls, MDM solutions. I don't expect you to give cost for them. I'm just saying, like, what are the big things? Is it time? You know, what is your perspective of the big cost items as you're going through this compliance? And I'll ask each of the folks on the panel that same question because they have different perspectives.
I will say, talking to some of the smaller companies I've talked to so far, a lot of them are a little terrified, a little nervous about this continuous monitoring piece. They've admittedly said, we don't know what that costs, but it sounds like we're basically hiring a whole staff or some additional person they feel like they can't afford. Anybody who's in cybersecurity knows that the cybersecurity skills gap and the number of people available to do certain jobs in cybersecurity, actually all of cybersecurity, honestly, it is really tight. So much like a lot of the other government sectors, you know, like medical professionals, the government is going to be competing, or companies are going to be competing with the government on hiring these cybersecurity specialists. I would say but the continuous monitoring piece, you know, paying somebody to be watching their networks for 24 hours, 7 days a week, to be able to give the information to trigger a response if necessary, is going to be a big cost driver. On top of, I would say the second thing would be creating the architecture. So all the technology associated, like you talk about your firewalls, you talk about your persistent detection and your your perimeter architectures and those kind of things. I think that's going to be pretty expensive. The third most expensive thing will be people in training. I think a lot of companies are going to have to shift some of their human resource focus on hiring the right people and keeping the right people, but also training the right people. You can hire us, but we still have to train too, because things keep changing.
Awesome. All right. Ali, what is your perspective on costs? You've been doing this for a bit now for people, and you know, you obviously recommend different mitigation strategies for folks. What are some of those things that you see? If they're different than Alicia's, if not, that's cool. I'll ask you another question.
Sure. You know, I guess it's another perspective. I wouldn't say it's a difference. Cost-wise, you know, the only factor right now is no one really knows, you know, with some of the assessment portion of things, just because as we're getting more of them coming, more of these organizations getting certified, those will have variability. And I would say a lot of these costs are really dependent on really how prepared you are as an organization, how much you have a lot of this sort of straightforward plan and in place. You know, the better it's, you know, buttoned up, the cheaper a lot of this goes through. But, you know, just to offer a different perspective, I've talked to a lot of organizations that I've worked with, you know, trying to look at this as an in-house scenario, as an in-house item. You know, the first thing I always say is, you know, unfortunately, this is not a task, this is a program. So your mindset has to shift a little bit about how you approach this. If you approach it as a program, then you start thinking about, okay, resources and all the variable costs that go with it. And so if you think about the difference between outsource and insource, you know, you have to think about resource costs, you have to think about, you know, software costs, licensing, and there are a lot of benefits, you know, with this being a program of, you know, figuring out whether or not you can get external resources or external partners to work with you to supplement a lot of these costs. Because if you're looking for cost reduction, a lot of times go with the organization that's sort of spreading their internal costs amongst a good group of other customers, because chances are it's going to be a lot cheaper in order to do it and look at it, that approach versus trying to insource. So it's sort of supporting what we're representing here, but, you know, offering a different perspective when you start thinking about costs. And there's a misconception of really trying to do everything internally because there's a lot of other peripheral things, including resources that an organization has to think of. So
Yeah,
I'll
I
leave it
think
at that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think for any small business, the first instinct is to try to do it yourself, right? It generally is you look at all those controls, you're like, I can fill that out, I can do that. And then you start getting into how long is that going to take, because you're not dedicated to it. And that the cost of one, extending it, but the cost of not having stuff in place at a moment in time where something happens to the organization. Marcella, if you can sort of if you were saying right now at the 1257 point, what are the top 3 things for someone to look at purchasing in order to at least get the baseline controls in place? Granted, there's a whole bunch of other work in policies and practice and all that, but what are the 3? If there's 2 or 4, that's fine too. I'm just think 3
Yeah,
seems
sure.
to be the right number.
So I think that first of all is making sure that you at least have one security expert that you're actually going to help you with this. Like I said, I mean, IT people are great, but there's a big difference between an IT person and a security person. And if you can't afford to have a security team in-house, then that's absolutely something that you should outsource, even if it's just initially to get you the help that you need to get started. I think it's really important to make sure that you at least have one person who is very hyper security focused. The second thing I would say is having a good assessment in place is really important, because again, you need to know where you stand. We talked a little bit about what kind of security measures to put into place. What I would say is that, while I mentioned firewalls and endpoint detection, the best way for you to actually identify what security measures you should put into place is by going through a risk assessment process. Because everybody's network is different. Everybody has a different business model, and that business model will actually drive how you should be running and monitoring your security and what security protections you should put into place, because every organization will have different weak points. So it's really finding someone who understands security to help you started with the process, getting an assessment into place as soon as possible so that you understand where you need to go, and then really taking the results of that assessment seriously. And based off of that assessment, even if you can't cover down every single different component of that assessment of all of the priority tasks that assessment is telling you, I would say at least hyper focused on the most critical ones. And hyper focus on protecting the most critical assets and data within your environment at a minimum, right? So it's the equivalent of when Alicia said, if you have your doors locked in your house, if you have a safe upstairs, or if you have crown jewels or something that's really important to you, make sure that that's locked up first and foremost, because you want to make sure that that's always protected.
All right, excellent. We're running out of time. We started a couple minutes late, so we'll go a couple more minutes. From my perspective, and since we've been through this process, the first thing that we realized we had to buy is a decent firewall, right? Because even though we've outsourced most of our infrastructure to Amazon and Azure and Google, we still have an office full of laptops, not servers, but laptops. So understanding what's going in and out of the network, whether it's a wireless internal network or whatever, is, I think, very important to at least understand. If your office is at home, the question then becomes, if you have employees in your small business and your office is at home, but all your employees are remote and they are doing work with the organization that possibly could touch CUI or other sensitive information, do you have an endpoint system, whether it's McAfee or Norton? We use CrowdStrike, and we're not trying to sell anything here. I'm just telling you, we invested in CrowdStrike. It's not that expensive for what it gives you. We bought a $1,400 Fortinet firewall, and it's those kinds of little things that also can, from a technology side, get you in a pretty decent place before you have to go through every single part of the controls. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the cost of this and how you could be reimbursed for the cost. So real quickly, I'll let you guys talk a little bit about the DoD side. Can this stuff be thrown into your rates as you build up rates and stuff like that? And we'll also talk about some really cool programs inside of, at least in Maryland, that we use to reimburse us for both part of our assessment and part of our mitigation. So maybe Ali, if you can talk a little bit about the DoD side of it, and how you guys, Alicia, you'll be next on this one. Just talk about a little bit how we see getting reimbursed through the DoD bar.
Sure. So I'm going to give you everyone the official answer, and then I'm going to give you the answer that what's sort of being worked on, right? The official answer is that level 1 costs are supported by the DoD. So you could, if you're going through level 1 assessment and you have costs associated with that, you can transfer that cost over to your proposal. Now, what's really important is level 3. Level 3 is what is really the more expensive cost. And so currently the administration, and again, this is being worked on, everyone's looking at ways to mitigate costs. Although there isn't something official currently, they are working on something to capture level 3. A lot of times I've heard other organizations look at this as a ODC cost, right? And so if you add it as an ODC on top of your baseline cost for the rates, especially if you're doing services, that's an option, and just increase that percentage. You know, there's a lot of other organizations we work with that focus on providing costing structures for companies going after bids, and they have a lot of insights into how to structure that via an ODC. So I would suggest talking to a professional there. But again, official answer is level 1. Unofficially, you're probably going to start seeing items trickle down on the federal side for level 3 and beyond.
Excellent. Alicia, any adds to that?
Yeah, Ollie's right. They're still working through that level 3 costing model as far as what can be considered allowable cost. I know when that phrase was first used, everybody was up in arms. So the Defense Acquisition University, who's training the acquisition and contracting professionals on the DoD side who have to implement and look for these practices in the RFPs, they were explicitly told initially that only the 20 additional controls per CMMC would be considered allowable on the level 3. I think there's been some back and forth. Ollie, you may have gotten more recent information. I'm getting it from my DAU guys, so that might be where the rub is. The DAU, DoD, and industry all kind of fighting over what does that mean. And again, that's level 3. That seems to be where everybody's focused on, because as you noticed on that chart we had earlier in the conversation, that cost jumps up exponentially. I mean, that is really very pricey, especially if you're a small tiered business and you finding out you have to be level 3 for whatever reason.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I think we're out of time for everybody. This is a series, so you'll probably get a survey after this asking you if you found any value in this. Our goal really is, as we move through this was a foundational one, is to really give you very specific guidance and answer very specific questions. Since we've gone through this and we understand sort of where you have to go and what you have to do, we look at this as a community kind of thing, small and mid-sized businesses working together to get there. There is MEP programs, which you're seeing up on the slide. If you work through Ali's group or any of the other assessors, they can give you access to those groups. And we did it, and we were able to pick up the cost of our firewall, our continuous monitoring, those types of things we were able to get reimbursed for. You do the initial payment, you submit the documents, they prove that you did the assessment, and then you basically get reimbursed. Then the mitigation kind of stuff, you also get up to, I think, 12,000. Don't quote me on this. You can definitely hit them up directly or go to their website. It's an awesome organization for small businesses trying to get through this initial phase. So I think having some expertise along the way guiding you it will save a lot of headaches. After that, getting somebody to help pay for it can't hurt. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, panel. And then we'll be having this in a couple months. We'll come up and talk probably after 2 months more of the information coming out of DoD. We'll have a better feel for exactly what's going on. Thank you very much.